I watched my first splatter film with my church. They rented out the entire theater. My pastor, youth pastor, choir director, all of the deacons, and countless other lifelong members of the church. People I had prayed and praised with, who had molded my entire 14-year-old worldview. We watched as Jesus' blood splashed across the screen. We watched his skin shred and his knees give out. His lips gurgled and moaned. When we got back to the church to share our reactions with each other, half an hour's worth of driving in the cold light of day hadn't really pepped anybody up. We were still drained. We spoke in these subdued volumes about how powerful it was. I can't believe he did all that for me, we said. It had been exactly what we hoped it would be. It had been torture. The Passion of the Christ, a splatter film savior. There have been dozens of movies made about the life of Jesus Christ, and the most profitable one by far has been the one that has focused exclusively on the agonies of the crucifixion. In fact, to say it's the most profitable movie based on the life of Jesus, or even the most profitable movie based on a religious text, is still underselling it. To this day, The Passion of the Christ retains the record for the highest American domestic box office for an R-rated film of all time. It was a gigantic cultural moment. Everybody was seeing this movie. Everybody was talking about this movie. Even 90-year-old Edna Oatman from Pleasantville, New Jersey, all dressed up in her Sunday best for her first cinema visit since seeing E.T. in 1982. Imagine hating E.T. that much. Edna, like many Christians, expressed a hope that maybe this will get people going to church. And I remember showing up at my high school the week after it premiered and looking around to see if I noticed any signs of revival. And, well, I didn't. In fact, the less familiar with Christianity someone was, the more baffled by this movie they were likely to be. I watched The Passion of the Christ several times during the making of this video, and for one of these viewings, as a bit of an informal experiment, I decided to invite some non-Christians. They gave me 2 brief reviews: gross and boring. The charges of anti-Semitism and homophobia hurled at the movie seemed too narrow. Its general disgust for humanity is so unrelenting that the military-sounding drums at the end seem to be welcoming the apocalypse. If I were a Christian, I'd be appalled to have this primitive and pornographic bloodbath presumed to speak for me. The violence in Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ is so obscene, you question the mentality of the people behind the movie. Gibson's The Passion of the Christ is a work from which love and compassion for humanity, everything Christ-like in the best sense of the word, are largely absent. It is disheartening to see a film made with evident and abundant religious conviction that is at the same time so utterly lacking in grace.
Now, critics who have a problem with me don't really have a problem with me in this film. They have a problem with the 4 Gospels. That's their problem is.
Many Christians celebrated and defended this movie based on its historical and biblical accuracy, with even the Pope himself allegedly saying, "It is as it was." Is that what popes do? But there's no such thing as objectively true filmmaking. Even documentaries have writers and directors. As with any adaptation, we would do well to remember that it is as the director imagines it was. The Passion of the Christ distinguishes itself from other Jesus media by beginning and ending with Jesus' death. It starts with his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane and ends when they pull his dead body off of the cross. And there's any number of ways to tell the story of the crucifixion on film, but the Passion gives us a one-size-fits-all Jesus who is fighting a bloody, black and white battle between good and evil, in which spiritual hierarchy is more important than morals or ideas. And I want to really interrogate this idea of accuracy in the name of moving beyond this flawed concept to a much more interesting and difficult question. Is this the way Jesus would want his story to be told? By the way, I'm going to be using a lot of language that takes as a given that what Christians believe about the Bible is true. Not because I'm trying to convert or alienate you, but simply because I'm trying to prove that this movie is problematic even from a Christian perspective, especially from a Christian perspective. It's also just rhetorically easier. I have no interest in destroying Christianity because I hate God or whatever the comment section is inevitably going to say. The frustrations I have with evangelical Christianity actually comes from a deep affection for the people that I grew up with and a genuine desire to see them succeed in embodying the divine love that they worship so devoutly. So before I unsheath my critical claws, I want to spend some time listing 4 quick things that I learned from my church upbringing that I'm genuinely grateful for. This very YouTube channel probably wouldn't exist if I hadn't cultivated a love of analyzing and finding meaning in art, a journey which began in Bible study. What is a sermon if not a live performance of an essay? I had a lot of really good adult role models growing up. My parents in particular take their faith very seriously, and I think that instilled in me a desire to seek out some kind of higher purpose beyond my own financial and social needs. Hearing this might make them slap their foreheads, but in a very real way, their example is the origin story to my interest in social justice and progressive values. Singing worship songs gave me a love of unironically expressing big emotions. Worship is really one of the few places in Western society where someone can be so vulnerable in such an over-the-top way, which probably led to my love of acting, honestly. Worship showed me how performance can be a pathway to truth. Constantly being invited to offer up prayer requests really normalized asking for help instead of carrying all my worries by myself. We had a few people die unexpectedly over the years, and mourning together as a collective, laying hands on and praying for those who were hurting the most, and singing praises in spite of the pain ranks among some of the most beautiful experiences of my life. So with all that being said, welcome to Acolytes of Horror, where we examine the horrors of life through the horrors of film. My name is Nathan, and tonight I'm scared of Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. Part 1. That Should Be Me Up There. Let's start by admitting that it's pretty rad that they found a way to get conservative Christians, whose movies are usually about as artistically provocative as a light pat on the head, to come out en masse to an ultra-violent R-rated tragedy in a foreign language. There's something kind of punk rock about that. The choice to write the screenplay in Latin, Hebrew, and Aramaic is a truly insane idea that is probably the main reason why Mel Gibson had to bankroll the entire movie by himself. But I gotta say, the musicality of these beautiful languages really does add this sense of timeless, operatic grandeur that perfectly complements the reverent cinematography of Caleb Deschanel. Mel Gibson's original intention was to release this movie without subtitles at all, and so when I sat down to rewatch it for this video for the first time in like 10 years, that's how I watched it. And I didn't miss a thing. The visual storytelling is coherent and often gorgeous. The effect is like that of a stained glass window come to life. Emotion is preserved in slow-mo to let us luxuriate and worship the titanic awesomeness of this infamous 12 hours, which Whether you believe it's fact or fiction has irrefutably gone on to shape the lives and governments of billions of people for thousands of years. There is no more bombastically confident expression of the Christian belief that the crucifixion matters more than anything has ever mattered. The entire selling point of this movie is an invitation to role play as if you were suffering the horrors of the crucifixion firsthand. Influential Christian writer Lee Strobel reacted to it by saying, "For the first time in my life, I really felt as if I were experiencing what Jesus had endured." So let's talk about how and why that was achieved. Starting with the slow motion. Slow motion refines chaos into harmony. Action films have long used this technique to make their heroes look cool and in control in the middle of shootouts and fistfights. But the Passion of the Christ twists this to revel instead on Jesus' pain. Almost every shot is either of Jesus suffering or of someone watching him suffer. The audience is almost never positioned as a farther away, objective observer. Instead, everything is shot pretty much always in close-ups, which, combined with the slow-mo, keeps us laser-focused on Jesus' agony. Physical sensation overwhelms meaning. Compare the Passion's violence to when Jean-Luc Godard actually tortured his actor in Le Petit Soldat. He burned him with a lighter, waterboarded, and electrocuted him.
Do not do this to your actors.
In Le Petit Soldat, the violence looks clumsy, and we often cut away to the terrorists going about their daily routines while the whole thing is narrated by the victim, whose actor gives a very deadpan delivery. So the violence is just one element of what you see and hear. It competes for our attention with the rest of the world around it, just like it would if we were to actually witness something like that in real life, where close-ups and slow motion don't exist. Even though Le Petit Soldat's violence is more real than the Passion's, it's comparatively underwhelming, which I think is what makes it so disturbing. You can see how a torturer could get used to this kind of thing. In the Passion, each moment of violence takes up the entire screen, the slow motion romantically enshrining each frame of the film with a feeling of perverse beauty and even order, reminding us that this was all predestined since the dawn of man. We often linger on Jesus' steely gaze of determination, reminding us that just like those slow-mo action heroes, he is, in a cosmic sense, still in control. Everything is going according to God's plan. I want to quote a lengthy passage from a Stephen King article because I think it best articulates why so many people have such a problem with the Passion's violence, while also kind of missing a crucial part of why Christians found it so irresistible. About 10 minutes before the movie started, a well-dressed woman of about 30 entered the rapidly filling theater with a girl and 2 boys in tow. The boys looked about 6 years old. I didn't get a chance to observe them. I was on the wrong side of Mom for that. The little girl I've chosen to call Alicia, however, sat on my side. Cute little thing, you bet. Blue dress, spandy clean knee socks, matching white ribbons in her dark hair. I'd say she was no more than 10 and probably only 8. I kept sneaking glances at Alicia as the movie played. She did okay until the scourging of Christ. Then she did indeed close her eyes and buried her face against her mother's side. The little body inside the blue dress was all angles, an exclamation mark of horror. Gibson's version of the scourging seems to go on forever, as the Roman punishment detail uses first a whip and then a spiked lash to literally peel the flesh from Jesus' body, spattering the cobbles around him with gore. Alicia hid her face for 15 minutes, but that left another 50 minutes of punishment, torture, cruelty, and death still to go. And was I ashamed to be in that theater? Even though the film Gibson has made is, if taken on its own artistic and religious terms, good, perhaps even great, I was. I feel that shame heating my skin even now, days later. Because 50 minutes is a long time to hide your eyes when you're only 8. So after a while, you see, our sweet little girl stopped doing it. The child I've chosen to call Alicia looked and looked and looked. I think she'll be looking for a long time to come, in her dreams. In those dreams, there will likely be no redemption, no victory over sin, no scripture, no eternal life. I think in Alicia's dreams, there will only be a skinless nightmare Christ with one eye swollen shut. Stephen King misunderstands why that mom brought those kids to that theater. Other Jesus media downplays the gore to focus instead on the themes that Stephen King mentions about redemption, eternal life, and all that other good stuff. And he's correct to observe that The Passion of the Christ does not evoke those values. Any film that all but skips the ministry that came before the crucifixion and the resurrection that came after clearly has other things on its mind. But those values are not the only things that the crucifixion represents to much of the evangelical community. Alicia's mom wanted her kids to have to face that horror. The pain is the point. I did a lot of research on how Christians reacted to this movie, and again and again and again, this same sentiment keeps getting repeated. That should be me up there on that cross. He did that for me. This is the most moving of all the films about Christ. I don't usually cry when watching a film, but this was gut-wrenching, as it really was. To know that Christ walked into this knowing what would happen simply rips our hearts out. And if we believe Jesus was the Christ, but also completely man, then the suffering had to be real. Otherwise, he didn't really feel the pain and suffering, and then the entire point of the crucifixion is lost. So, gory and bloody and horrible as depicted, it needs to be for us to even begin to understand the sacrifice made by the Father, to submit his beloved Son to such as this, because of God's love of us. As a person who believes in him, I never close my eyes to the torture he received before being crucified. I see, accept, and contemplate, what if I were in his position? What if it was my family that was crucified? What if he never atoned for human sins? Knowing he has paid for my sin makes me so grateful. Imagine having to endure everything you watch, intentionally going through every bit of the pain and suffering, even before he was forced to carry his own cross to the spot where he would knowingly let them nail his body onto the cross before being lifted to its standing position. It should be each and every one of us on that cross. Most Christians believe that Jesus died on the cross for the sins of the world as a kind of checkmate in a chess match between God and Satan, in which Jesus' blood somehow cleanses our souls if we ask for it, enabling us to enter God's holy presence in heaven when we die. And our inherent sinfulness is a big part of what evangelists appeal to when trying to win converts. If you feel like you're bad, that's because you are bad, but don't worry, because even though you don't deserve it, God loves and wants you anyway. All you have to do is accept that love. There's a part in The Passion where a bloody Jesus briefly meets his mother on the way to Calvary, and all he manages to say is, "See, Mother, I make all things new." This is a strange thing to say to someone who doesn't understand the spiritual significance of what's going on. Like, imagine a death row inmate saying that as his last words. You'd be like, what? Jesus isn't really talking to Mary so much as the movie's audience of Christians. This line is actually taken from the book of Revelation, in which Jesus is talking about making a literal new world after the apocalypse. But it's been popular for modern Christian culture to reappropriate this line to mean Jesus making all things new within the believer's heart. And that can be a really uplifting thought, but there's a darker side to this line of thinking that can creep into your subconsciousness. I spoke in my earlier video on Midsommar about how I must have gotten saved at a dozen different altar calls back in the day. In that video, I focused on how the theatricality of altar calls are designed to inspire overpowering emotions that are more likely to compel people to step forward and make some big declaration that their life has changed forever. But now I bring it up again to ask, why was one confession not enough for me? Why is it that no matter how many times I stepped forward to rededicate my life to Christ, I still felt like I was bad? Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, a wretch like me, a wretch like me. I'd step forward and confess my sins as I've been taught to do my entire life, as I'd already been doing every time I bowed my head and closed my eyes. I asked God to forgive me of my sins all the time, whether I was at a church revival or simply saying grace before digging into some macaroni and cheese. Which sins needed forgiving? I don't know. All of them, I guess. That's what I would say every time I bowed my head and closed my eyes. Lord, forgive me of all my sins. Lord, forgive me of all my sins. More of a mantra than a confession. Looking back, it kind of feels like what I was really saying was, I am sorry for being alive. The darker side of needing someone to make all things new is the implication that everything you already are is trash. This guilt isn't always emphasized in every Christian church. My church that I grew up in was pretty good about spending most of their energy on trying to inspire people, but in my experience, it's rare for it to ever be totally absent. For some, it even seems to be their main connection to God, this absolute amazement that anybody could ever love a wretch like me. I suppose some people's belief in their own badness is the thing that feels most real to them, and so God's goodness has to be filtered through that lens. The Passion of the Christ, more than any other piece of Jesus media that came before or after, lavishly indulges this guilt. That is what Alicia's mom wanted her kids to experience. That is what people mean when they say that this film feels real or accurate. And that is why Mel Gibson takes so many creative liberties to add as many extra details to the PG-rated biblical accounts to make it as violent as humanly possible. Because the main way that people defend this film is on the grounds of biblical accuracy, let's take a moment to list all the ways that Mel Gibson adds violence that isn't even hinted at in the Bible. After Jesus is captured in the garden, they beat him up, tie him with ropes, and throw him over the side of a bridge so he has to dangle painfully over the ground. The Bible says nothing of Jesus being beaten on his way to Calvary, but Mel Gibson's Jesus is punched and kicked down to the ground 4 times, and then he collapses from exhaustion twice more after that. When they're nailing his hands to the cross, they have to pull one of his arms out of its socket to pound the hand into the spot where it's supposed to go. After he's nailed in, they flip the cross over so he has to dangle parallel to the ground before they raise it up. Nowhere are the priorities of this movie laid bare more than the scourging of Christ by the Roman officials. This is how the Bible describes this incident, and indulge me as I read all 4 unabridged passages from each of the Gospels. Matthew: he had Jesus flogged. Mark: he had Jesus flogged. Luke: I will punish him. John: then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The The Passion of the Christ extends this to a whopping 12 minutes. Almost 10% of the entire movie, and far longer than any individual torture scene in any of the Saw movies. Jesus is whipped so hard that chunks of flesh are ripped out of his back until the bones of his ribs are exposed. And then they flip him over and tear into his stomach and chest until every inch of his skin looks like a peeled tomato. He's beaten so far beyond the capacity for any human to believably still be alive that by the end, Jesus looks like he just staggered out of an Alexandra Waliszewska painting. When this movie comes up in casual conversation, as it often has for me in the last few months, every time somebody's asked me what I've been up to, this scene is almost always the first thing that comes to people's mind. Really, the scourging upstages the crucifixion, which is fitting because the whole movie functions as a kind of self-flagellation. The Passion of the Christ is a splatter film. At least it is if we go by Wikipedia's really well-written definition. It is fascinated with the vulnerability of the human body and the theatricality of its mutilation. And you know, this mutilation, it can make us feel a lot of different ways depending on how it's presented. It can actually make us feel joyful if we're watching Peter Jackson's Bad Taste, as if we're gallivanting around our hometown with our weirdo best friends.
Suck my spinning steel, shithead!
Or it can make us wish we were doing literally anything else if we're watching Ruggero Deodato's Cannibal Holocaust, which is the work of an abuser who is torturing his subjects physically, sexually, and emotionally right before our very eyes. Seriously, just watch Man Bites Dog instead. It's just as fucked up, has all the same themes, except those themes are actually explored, and in the making of the movie, nobody had to pretend to rape an unpaid indigenous Colombian woman or rip open a live turtle. The mutilation of the body in The Passion of the Christ really drives a nail right through the central nerve of Christian guilt's feeling that the body is a nasty sack of sin that it is our duty to overpower. As a teenager, I experienced normal sexual fantasies the way an alcoholic does a stocked liquor cabinet. I should resist it. I can't resist it. I didn't resist it, but next time I'll be better. I can't tell you how many times I've heard a pastor speak in breathless tones about the new bodies we're going to get when we're in heaven, which I guess will be pure and immune to temptation, and one cannot help but compare your current body to the perfected self that you're going to be whenever you get this new body. The Passion of the Christ presents Jesus' sacrifice as a punishment of the human body. Jesus could at any moment spirit away up to heaven and ditch this whole bad scene. And so the central conflict of the entire movie is of Jesus' efforts to remain inside the mortal coil that so many Christians look forward to one day abandoning. Jesus doesn't deserve what's happening to him, but the film suggests that the human body does. Your human body does. The gory avalanche of slow-motion close-ups make us feel like a dog whose nose is being rubbed in its own delinquent dining room poo. Look what you did. Which I think is why so many non-Christians bounced off of this movie, because if you haven't grown up in this culture, the only normal reaction to all this is, well, wait a minute. I don't deserve to be flayed alive. In fact, nobody does.
So who killed Jesus Christ?
The big answer is, we all did. I'll be first in the culpability stakes here.
It's your hand in the film holding the nail?
It is. Yeah, my left hand.
The Passion of the Christ is less interested in the historical accuracy of the crucifixion than it is in dramatizing how that story makes a lot of Christians feel. The Jesus of the Passion isn't really dying for our sins so much as he is for our self-loathing. And as such, the the violence has to be as brutal as we are to ourselves. The crucifixion ends in a tableau where Mary looks directly into the camera, accusing us of taking part in the horrors we have just witnessed. There is no invitation in this gaze, only blame. Part 2. The Power of Christ. The greatest success and greatest problem of the Passion of the Christ lies in its very premise. By limiting the setting to the 12 hours leading up to Jesus' death, it tells an incomplete story, and so the audience is required to fill in the blanks with whatever they already believe. Anyone who's read the Gospels can tell you that Jesus was a talker. Some Bibles print the words of Jesus in red, and as you can see, there's a lot of red in here. The man had a lot to say. Just about the only time that Jesus isn't talking is during his crucifixion. Jim Caviezel Jesus is an utterly passive protagonist who does little more than stand in silence, so he can be whoever you want him to be. Your grandpa can see him as a strong leader, while your mom can connect with him as a loving lamb. This is why it can be hard to argue with someone who loves this movie, because a lot of their connection to it lies in the ways that they fill in what it leaves blank. But as far as what is actually on the screen, the most important value that Jesus embodies is power. Through all his pain and suffering, Jesus remains tough as nails, an action hero trapped in a horror story, biding his time until Judgment Day. When Satan rather phallically pesters Jesus with a snake, he stomps its head in. After getting his back ripped open by whips and the guards seem ready to quit, he stands back up as if to ask for more. When he's been beaten so thoroughly that he can't even stand up, he crawls on his hands and knees towards the very cross on which he's about to be nailed. These are the most climactic choices that Jesus makes in the entire narrative. Far more than being the Prince of Peace or the rabble-rousing revolutionary of radical love, Mel Gibson's Jesus is one hardcore dude. Because he hardly ever speaks, the source of this Jesus' power is in his divine gaze. A cyclops beam of holiness that stops people in their tracks with a single glance. A lot of Jesus movies give him this quasi-superpower, which can get a bit silly. This is actually how Cecil B. DeMille introduces us to his Jesus in The King of Kings, a gaze which causes Mary Magdalene to immediately go from prostitute to piety. Robert Powell's Jesus in Jesus of Nazareth in particular pretty much never blinks during its entire 6-hour runtime. But Robert Powell plays this with an interesting vulnerability, as if he's genuinely curious about how people are going to react to what he's about to say. When he really turns those baby blues up to full God mode during Simon and Andrew and then later Mary Magdalene scenes, it's after these people have already decided to believe in him, so it's not like he's overpowering their disbelief. One thing I really like about Max von Sydow's Jesus in The Greatest Story Ever Told is that people respond to him more because of what he has to say instead of a display of raw power.
I heard what he said last night. I liked it. If he's going to say anything else, I want to hear it.
But at least the divine gaze of Jesus of Nazareth and King of Kings invites people in. The divine gaze of the Passion of the Christ looks through people. When he looks them in the eye, people tend to recoil away. When they see Christ, they only see their own shame. The Passion has a few pre-crucifixion flashbacks that give the audience a little breather in between beatings. And even here, Jesus is above all dominant. In the scene where Jesus saves the adulterous woman from being executed, his famous quote about how "He who is without sin cast the first stone" is omitted, creating the impression that he scares off the Pharisees through the sheer visceral force of his mean mug, and by his sand drawing skills. This is the only divine gaze we see that leads to a conversion, and notice how he is towering over her. The Sermon on the Mount is shot from a low angle so that Jesus is towering over us, bathed in blinding sunlight. When he's washing the apostles' feet, we don't look down on him from John's perspective to reflect on Christ's humility. Instead, the person that Jesus is serving is so unimportant that his back is to us, and he is eventually cropped out so that we can better feel the power of Jesus' authority. Even the funny little domestic scene that the movie invents with Mary, in which Jesus actually smiles and jokes around, gives us manly man carpenter Jesus. The joke of the scene is that he knows more than Mary about the future of the world's dining habits, and he can't even submit to letting Mary wash his hands without splashing her face. I'm not knocking it, it's one of my favorite scenes, but come on, just look at that alpha male. I'd follow that guy to Calvary, or I guess now it would be a QAnon convention. In the frankly amazing final shot of the film, we follow the stone over his grave being rolled back, then the shadow retreating across the tomb. The dead body disappears underneath the bandages, and then there's Jesus, standing up and walking naked with the power and purpose of a time-traveling Terminator. Battle drums pound as Gibson is unable to resist lingering at the last moment on the dried gore of Jesus' mangled, holy hand. Battle scars from a fight well fought. Interlude, the many faces of Jesus. Let's take a moment to acknowledge what an impossibly subjective task it is for a filmmaker or anyone to definitively declare who Jesus was and what he represents. For Christians, Jesus is the perfect person, and perfection is always, to some extent, going to be a matter of personal taste. So, of course, the guy who did Lethal Weapon and Braveheart sees Jesus as a badass whose sacrifice manifests as a kind of revenge, as we'll get to later. If we look through other portrayals of Jesus throughout cinematic history, it's actually really wild how different each Jesus is. The Jesus of 1927's King of Kings is more of a father figure. The Jesus of 1965's The Greatest Story Ever Told is an ethereal teacher that we can only look up to. The Jesus of today's ongoing TV series, The Chosen, is presented as our buddy, and is maybe the most obvious reflection of his time simply by being the only Jesus in this video who is played by an actor with actual Middle Eastern heritage. And if we broaden our scope beyond just movies, the character of Jesus changes throughout history too. Even the way we imagine how other generations imagined Jesus reeks of revisionism. Like, for example, Christians like to point to the faith of the Founding Fathers as evidence that America was intended to be a Christian nation, but those Christians would probably find the Founding Fathers' version of Christianity quite blasphemous. Almost all of the Founding Fathers subscribed to a theological philosophy known as deism, which believes that God created the world and then pretty much just left it to its own devices. They believed that Jesus was a brilliant teacher who was only human. And Thomas Jefferson even went so far as to make his own personal version of the New Testament condensed down to 46 pages, cutting out all the miracles and leaving only the ethics. In my research for this video, I read a cool book called Jesus Made in America, which tracks the different ways that Americans have related to Jesus from the Puritans to the Passion of the Christ, as the book cover says. And I couldn't stop laughing at how the writer, Stephen J. Nichols, kept expressing a frustration with how American Christians tend to be ignorant of the histories and complexities of theology. Interesting how a professor thinks that the best way to relate to Jesus is by being more of an academic. In Cinematic Savior, Hollywood's Making of the American Christ, Stevenson Humphreys Brooks writes that whenever we are comfortable with a representation, particularly of another historical period or culture, it may be that we are seeing what we want to see, not what is. So, it begs the question, what is Jesus like in the actual Bible? I've read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John many times throughout my life, and I've had passages read to me many, many more times, but for this video, I sat down with my old trusty Bible and did something I'd never done before. I read all 4 Gospels in one sitting. And when you aren't reading these things in half-chapter sections, after which a pastor tells you what they mean, or maybe you privately meditate on how to apply those passages to whatever's going on in your life, if you just let the text stampede across your eyes, it's actually kind of shocking how prickly and even hostile Jesus is. When Jesus shows love or humility, those moments tend to be described with prose. Jesus looked at him and loved him, or Jesus had compassion on them. But whenever he's directly quoted, he seems like kind of a hard guy to get too relaxed around. Rabbi!
Hey!
The rabbi's here, everybody! When did you get here?
I tell you the truth, you are looking for me not because you saw miraculous signs, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life.
Could you, explain the parable to us?
Are you still so dull? Be careful. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod.
What the hell is he talking about? It is because we have no bread. Why didn't we get bread? So
Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear?
Hey, your mother and brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you.
Who is my mother and who are my brothers? Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister.
So, should I, tell your mom to just get in line? Or... The man seemed to be fundamentally incapable of giving a direct response to even the simplest thing, unless it concerned how all the religious leaders of his day were going straight to hell. Seriously, there was one point where he just goes, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites," and just repeats it 7 times in the same chapter. But overall, both friends and foes alike tend to not really ever fully understand just about anything he says, which regularly frustrates Jesus. The only Jesus movie I've seen that really channels this aggrieved intensity is Paolo Pasolini's The Gospel According to St. Matthew. Love is a heavy burden for this Jesus, who is constantly frustrated by humanity's compulsion to complicate what should be simple and pure. Compare the brief Sermon on the Mount scene of the Passion, whose focus is on visual splendor and only lasts a few seconds, to these 14 close-ups that Pasolini cuts together all in a row, which makes us feel a bit like we're being bombarded. I'm obviously speeding it up a bit here, but this sequence goes on for over 5 minutes in the actual movie. It's direct, blunt, and visually uninterested in distracting us from what Jesus is actually saying. This is not a Jesus who wants you to sit back in slack-jawed awe at how majestic and powerful he is. He wants you to get up off your ass and be better. This movie also really helps you understand how there could be so many people chomping at the bit to kill this guy. Look at the fire and brimstone he dishes out drive-by shooting style to these random people just trying to go about their day.
Ravvedetevi perché il regno dei cieli è vicino.
It's a testament to just how much our culture influences our interpretation of a sacred text that when I first saw the Gospel of St. Matthew, I thought its vision of Jesus was so off base that I actually wondered if it wasn't supposed to be some kind of experimental reimagining of Jesus, more in the vein of a Jesus Christ Superstar or a Last Temptation of Christ. It wasn't until rereading the Gospels that I wound up feeling like this movie captured his essence the closest. The last half of this video is going to be about the rules that govern the world of the Passion of the Christ, and to some degree how it reflects the rules that govern much of modern American Christianity. Jesus' rules, some might say. Christian values. To which, after all this, we can't help but ask, right? Which Christians? Which Jesus? Part 3. Let his blood be on us and on our children. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin hath left its crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. This old hymn beautifully and concisely summarizes what Christians believe Jesus' sacrifice means. And notice how it alludes to a spiritual set of rules governing the cosmos. Rule number 1, God cannot coexist with sin. Rule number 2, a sacrifice can wash away sin. Now, whether God is bound to these rules or whether he made the rules up, and if he did make the rules up, why he made them up, that's something that Christians kind of just leave there. So that's what I'm going to do. We can understand the crucifixion as Jesus choosing to follow God's rules over humanity's rules. But because the Passion limits its scope to only Jesus' death, it never defines what those rules are. How does God want us to behave? How does humanity want us to behave? The Passion doesn't really care. Again, Christians are invited to fill in the blanks however they want, but if you don't know anything about Christianity and you see this movie, the only thing you're really going to understand about what's going on is that God's rules are good because Jesus is the main character, and humanity's rules are evil because Jews are evil. If you have read up on the Bible and you already know that Jesus spends his every waking breath raging against religious hypocrisy, then you might be able to watch The Passion and see in the Jewish leaders a profound moral about the foolishness of those who weaponize dogma to control instead of lead. All too often, it is our most powerful religious authorities who wouldn't know God if he slapped them in the face. But if you want to believe that the Jews killed Jesus because that's what Jews do, well, the movie makes plenty of space for you too.
You know, critics who have a problem with me don't really have a problem with me in this film. They have a problem with the four Gospels. That's their problem is.
Hopefully at this point in the video, that quote is hitting you a little bit differently. Now that we've talked about how Mel Gibson prioritized gore and guilt while hyping Jesus up to be a macho man of God, we can dismiss this for the deflection that it is. But if we don't treat it as a deflection, if we actually do ask, well, okay, what do the Gospels say about the Jewish Pharisees? Well, it actually gets pretty interesting. To be fair to The Passion, plenty of other Jesus films have also been accused of anti-Semitism. The fact of the matter is, it is true that in the Gospels, Jesus' antagonists are almost exclusively a gaggle of Jewish religious leaders. They hound him at every public appearance, sniveling and scheming. But if we dig a little bit deeper into the history of how the Gospels were made, we learn that the text was written a full generation after Jesus was crucified, and we're really not even all that sure they were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. What we do know is that they were very likely written in Roman languages in Roman cities, at a time when Christianity was firmly transitioning away from being a Jewish-led religion into a faith mostly comprised of Gentiles. If we respect the Gospels enough to afford them the same level of critical curiosity that we would give any historical text, it's hard not to notice how neutral the Roman language Gospels are about the Roman occupation of Israel. Many early Christians were slaves to Roman citizens, and it wasn't uncommon for them to be executed for treason because their faith was correctly seen as a threat to Roman paganism. So it would make a lot of sense that the writers of the Gospels would be timid about including any details that might piss off the Roman government any more than they had to. Before the crucifixion, the Gospels don't feature any Roman villains or even jerks. Roman occupation and oppression is kind of just in the background as an unchangeable fact of life, like the weather. Jesus himself never has a bad thing to say about Rome, and the ones who hope for him to overthrow Rome are depicted as completely missing the point of what he was all about. All of the Roman characters are actually believers until you get to Pilate, who is so reluctant to kill Jesus that he tries to save him with the whole Barabbas thing, even though executing charismatic troublemakers was kind of his whole job. Like, it must not have bothered him that much, because Pilate and Herod apparently enjoyed messing with Jesus so much that the book of Luke actually says, that day Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. Just really love how Jesus brings everyone together, you know? Not that this has to mean that the Gospels are lies, but undoubtedly, the writers of the Gospels crafted a narrative that served the needs of the people who lived at the time they were written. A narrative in which Roman colonization isn't that big of an issue, and the only real bad guys are the Jewish Pharisees. And it's easy to see how any details from Jesus' life that conflicted with their efforts to appease and appeal to Roman audiences were likely omitted in the name of rhetorical effectiveness. Filmmakers don't have the same fears as ancient Christians, thankfully. And so they have the freedom and historically have made more of an effort to explore these blind spots with more nuance. Some Jesus films emphasize the historically true fact that the Jewish leaders were only as powerful as Rome allowed them to be, suggesting that those who made it to the top of the Sanhedrin did so at least in part by licking the boot of a military that prided itself on killing Jews.
From now on, those vestments will stay in my headquarters, and those who defy us will not be allowed to wear them.
Or some films portray the Pharisees as being afraid that Jesus' popularity might provoke Rome into cracking down on the Jewish people even harder, which they do worry about in the book of John, so they get him killed before that can happen.
Governor Pilate wants to know what you're doing about this disturbance.
The man is being arrested.
Some of the films flesh out the characters of other members of the Jewish council who were sympathetic to Jesus, people who are also mentioned in the Bible. Or at the very least, they define the Pharisees not by their greed, but by their obsession with religious dogma, the same way the Bible does. The Passion of the Christ makes no effort to contextualize who these people are or why they hated Jesus. The only noticeable gesture towards curbing anti-Semitic interpretations is Mel Gibson's infamous decision to begrudgingly remove the English subtitles of Caiaphas' rendition of Matthew 27:25. Let his blood be on us and on our children, a verse which has been weaponized by bigots for nearly as long as Christianity has existed. The Passion doesn't have any scenes of Jesus' earlier conflicts with them to give us any kind of sense of what they disagreed about, except for that scene with the adulterous woman that has no dialogue, in which the Pharisees are completely out of focus. The blur makes them look more like a writhing mob of creatures, like the deacons of the deep in Dark Souls 3, sluggishly opulent, anonymously evil, and easily defeated. When Jesus is put on trial before the Sanhedrin, they aren't really depicted as people so much as a pack of hungry dogs. The movie finds plenty of time to add fictional scenes that flesh out the characters of Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, Pilate, and Pilate's wife. No such effort is spent on the Pharisees, who skitter around the story, waving their gold scepters and shrieking with rage.
The Sanhedrin should proclaim Jesus King of Judea and tell the Romans.
I would have to put it very well indeed for the Romans to take away their troops and their procurator.
The Sanhedrin should proclaim Jesus King.
I mean, just compare their costumes to the Pharisees in other films. It's not a good look. I don't usually care to use an artist's personal life to comment on their art, but in this case, it feels important to say out loud at least once that 2 years after the release of The Passion of the Christ, Mel Gibson was recorded spewing anti-Semitic hate speech, including "the Jews are responsible for all the wars in all the world." Years later, a screenwriter who was helping him develop a movie about the legendary Jewish warrior Judah Maccabee, presumably as a way to clean up his image, said that he repeatedly heard Mel Gibson refer to Jews as oven dodgers, a term that Winona Ryder also accused him of using at a party back in the 90s. In a 2013 Reader's Digest interview, he referred to the Holocaust as an inconsistent numbers game, seemingly implying that the severity of the genocide has been overblown. And this isn't even everything. We truly don't have time to catalog all of it one by one. I just say all this because, I don't know, I just think it's important for us to squirm with that ugliness for a moment. Partially because I think one of the ways he's gotten back into the mainstream a little bit lately has been by speaking with regret, using sanitized generalities, and also because I think maybe it speaks to how the Passion of the Christ portrays good and evil. The Passion of the Christ doesn't have any opinions about how people should or shouldn't behave, because good and evil isn't presented as something that you do. It's just who you are. Why are the believers good? Because the believers are good. Why are the Romans in charge? Because the Romans are in charge. Why are the Jews so evil? Well, those are the rules. Everything is black and white, and nobody can change unless a geyser of Jesus' blood literally splashes you in the face. Part 4. God is in control. The biblical Jesus talks about a whole host of different topics, but if I had to simplify his entire ministry down to one core value, I think it would have to be an utter disdain for hierarchy. He repeats and repeats and repeats and repeats. He who is first will be last. He who is last will be first. He was born in a manger. He was a danger to money changers and a friend to impoverished strangers. The Pharisees' whole big tragic flaw lies in their inability to let go of their expectations that the prophesied Messiah would come down from the clouds as a king, shooting lightning bolts at their oppressors, instead of a homeless guy from some podunk village riding into Jerusalem on a borrowed donkey and bragging about how he's going to tear down the temple of God with his bare hands. They keep bothering him with all these legalistic questions about whether the scriptures do or don't permit this or that, and Jesus always finds some clever answer to make them sound stupid for even asking, even going so far at one point as to say, hey look, All of Scripture can be simplified down to just 2 commandments. Love God, love people, that's it. The man spent his entire life just teabagging any rule designed to separate not just God and man, but also sinner and saint. The crucifixion is the culmination of this work. After Jesus is arrested, he's silent before Caiaphas, Herod, and Pilate because he refuses to acknowledge their authority. By ignoring them and willingly dying as God incarnate for the sins of those that the Pharisees and Romans looked down on, and then later by coming back from the dead, he is demonstrating in the most extreme possible way how the first will be last and the last will be first. The Passion of the Christ is about preserving hierarchy. There is a palpable outrage, not over humanity's capacity for cruelty to each other, but over their hubris in being cruel specifically to God, the boss. There's always been some element of dramatic irony to the crucifixion story, because we know that those who stand in judgment of Jesus will be judged by him after they die. You can talk big now, but one day, heads are gonna roll. Jim Caviezel Jesus may say, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," but more than any other piece of Jesus media, The Passion of the Christ makes its audience salivate for God's reckoning. In much the same way, we are frothing at the mouth to see William Wallace's revenge against the Englishman who killed his wife. After Jesus dies, the Gospels of Matthew and Mark reference a supernatural event. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks split. The tombs broke open, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs, and after Jesus' resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many people. And Mark only says, "The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom." Either the other 3 writers didn't think zombie saints were an interesting detail to include, or the guy who wrote Matthew got a little carried away. But notice how celebratory those passages are. The curtain in the temple symbolizes how Jesus' sacrifice removes a barrier between God and man, and Matthew's resurrected holy people frames this display of power as a moment of redemption and rebirth. The Passion of the Christ stages this earthquake as a rousing set piece of fist-pumping payback. Romans run in terror. Satan looks up from hell and shrieks like the Wicked Witch of the West in a rainstorm. And instead of just the curtain tearing, the entire Jewish temple and the Ark of the Covenant is split in two as Caiaphas howls in horror. It is finished. They are finished. And good riddance. The only way to interpret this scene is as God's wrath finally punishing the sinners. The whole sequence begins with the camera following a raindrop down from the heavens, as if it were the tears of God, and it hits the ground like a nuclear bomb. Both Caiaphas and Pilate are judged by God here. As I said before, Caiaphas gets a lengthy sequence involving the Jewish temple and the Ark of the Covenant being ripped in two. We smirk as he falls down and burns his hand on a hot torch, an omen of the hellfire in his future. The movie really gives us a moment to savor his anguish at seeing all of his holiest religious icons destroyed. God is in control. Someone liked this scene so much that they cut it out of the movie and threw it up on YouTube, where it now has over 5 million views. And notice the unfettered glee of this title and thumbnail. The moment they realize they killed the Son of God. Oh, you done goofed! This is the judgment that Pilate gets. Got him. The Passion of the Christ, on the whole, takes a much more measured approach to the Romans. For instance, the soldiers who flay Jesus alive are reprimanded by their superiors.
Aus! Satis! Non eum castigare usque ad mortem.
The whole army isn't sadistic, it's just a few bad apples. Pilate is the only villain who is given a scene to express the motivations behind his actions. He says that he's afraid the Pharisees will start a rebellion and that Caesar has threatened to execute him if there's any more unrest. So, again, it's all the Jews' fault. In the film, Pilate expresses the fear that Caiaphas will start a rebellion against Rome. Historically, this is highly unlikely. The priests were among the most politically conservative of all Jews, especially in their view of Rome. No rebellion against Rome ever started with priests, and there is no evidence that Caiaphas was threatening rebellion. Why would someone plotting revolution say, "We have no king but Caesar"? Another fun historical fact about Pilate is that it actually is true that he got in trouble with Caesar, but it's because he was crucifying too many people. Like, this dude was so cross-happy that the Emperor of Rome was like, bro. The Passion of the Christ is so ambivalent about the Romans because, like all cops and colonizers, they are there to uphold hierarchy. The Pharisees want chaos, and we can't have that, but the Romans just want order. And in this way, they're actually kind of similar to how the film presents Jesus. Because they omitted everything that he lived for, there is no context for what he is dying for. And what we are left with is a Jesus who is destined for glory because he is following the rules of the authority with the most power. What better term is there for a man who marches to his death because he was ordered to than a soldier? Besides Pilate, the villains of this movie are just pure evil. And they are evil because they don't obey any authority besides themselves. King Herod commands the Son of God to perform miracles for his own amusement. Barabbas is basically an orc who sneers at the Roman guards. These are the only bad guys whose evil isn't punished by the movie, but everyone else gets a good old-fashioned Old Testament butt-whooping. The guy on the cross who doesn't believe in Jesus gets his eyes pecked out by crows. Judas's fate in particular is ripped right out of a horror movie. By the way, I do have to take a moment to admire the visual storytelling of this shot where our eyes wander from Judas to the blurry shape in the background. Well before it sharpens into focus, we make out the grotesque, smiling face of a dead donkey, a reflection of Judas's jackassery, but more importantly, the donkey has a rope tied around his face. Even before he turns to look, Judas knows that his own death lurks behind him. The image sharpens as if God himself was telling Judas that this is the end of the line. When he hangs himself, all the loud horror movie noises are replaced by a peaceful silence. We are not meant to feel any pity for Judas here. His death is a moment of balance being restored. Instead of killing himself out of guilt over betraying someone he loved and respected, Judas dies in submission to a judgment that he knows he cannot escape. God is in control. The Passion presents the Pharisees as separate from the proper chain of power. They sneak around behind the backs of the Romans and force the Romans to punish someone that they don't want to by threatening to riot. Just like with Judas and all the other bad guys except for Pilate, they aren't given any lines to sketch out their motivations, so we can only assume that they are evil because they do not know their place. They dare to assert authority where they should have none. The idea that God is in control can be a really comforting thought in a lot of situations, but when it's filtered through all this hierarchical soldier talk, it's easy for it to slip from God is in control to God needs me to retake control. He is counting on his Christian soldiers to reclaim the world from all the outsiders looking to disrupt the natural order. In the post-9/11 world, the myth of the film comes into strong focus. A core of true Christian believers must convert the secular state to Christ and Christian values. This will save us from the Jew within, who stands in as a code designation of liberals, gays, and all those who oppose Christian American values. This movie came out in 2004, at a time when the Bush administration was invading, bombing, and torturing Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of deaths. The Abu Ghraib photos would come out just 3 months later, and through it all, Bush enjoyed unshakable support from the evangelical community, largely because he presented himself as a Christian soldier who was fighting what he called the axis of evil. Vote for me, and God will retake control. Christians were more susceptible to this kind of rhetoric than usual, thanks in large part to the efforts of influential pastors like Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and James Dobson, who had been popularizing a more politically militant version of Christianity called Dominionism since the 1980s. Dominionism believes that Christian doctrine should be enforced by law, and any space for non-Christian ideas to flourish represents an attack from Satan. Instead of seeing God in everyone, they looked for devils hiding in every corner of our culture, plotting to secularize the world to death. An infamous example of this mentality can be seen in this conversation between Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell just a day or two after 9/11. Like, imagine the news is on and they're still showing footage of firefighters pulling people out of the wreckage. You turn that off, turn on some nice uplifting Christian radio instead, and this comes on. The ACLU's got to take a lot of blame for this. Well, yes. And I know that I'll hear from them for this, but throwing God out successfully with the help of the federal court system, throwing God out of the public square, out of the schools. The abortionists have got to bear some burden for this because God will not be mocked. And when we destroy 40 million little innocent babies, we make God mad. I really believe that the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians who are trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, People for the American Way, all of them who have tried to secularize America, I point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen. To them, 9/11 was balance being restored. God was retaking control. In 2004, Christians had more government influence than they had in decades, but the passion reflected a community that still saw themselves as underdogs, besieged by a liberal conspiracy plotting to disrupt the natural order. They still see themselves that way. James Dobson's focus on the family has been a titan in the Christian culture wars for longer than I've been alive. And at age 87, the man is still at it. Let's read some of the headlines of his last few newsletters, shall we? Gender Crisis in America. Reawaken America before it's too late. The World Health Organization wants complete control of your mind and body. Stop them now. And my favorite, is America imploding? Let's read the first little bit of that, shall we? Have you observed that evil is having a heyday in America and the traditional family unit is also in dire trouble? Sadly, some of today's evangelical churches are silent regarding the wickedness that now grips our nation, and our country, as we know and love it, appears to be going down for its final count. It grieves me to write these words, yet here we are. In this particular newsletter, he declares the 10 central values of his ministry, and notice how they all revolve around preserving these legalistic hierarchies, governing concepts like marriage, sexuality, or righteousness, or about promoting and educating people on the only correct way to live. Notice how absolutely zero of these tenets are about showing love to another person, whether they think they deserve it or not. With the exception of, I guess, the first one, the biblical Jesus never concerned himself with any of this. But it doesn't really matter to people like James Dobson what Jesus would do. Balance must be restored. God needs me to retake control. Christians who approve of this kind of thing will say that they don't hate anybody. Love the sinner, hate the sin is a phrase you'll hear a lot. But when you look closer at what that love actually looks like when it's put to work as an actual verb, it really just translates to an open invitation for anybody to become exactly like they are. Real love is terrifying and vulnerable, especially when it comes to loving people that you don't really know anything about. So it's easier to just do what the passion does and retreat behind guilt, power, and control. Better the devil you know than the angel you don't. How many Christians watched the Passion of the Christ and saw themselves as the grief-stricken witnesses to Jesus' death, when really they are the Pharisees, using the powers of the state to terrorize people who are just trying to hang out in their own little gardens of Gethsemane? They still long for the Messiah of the Pharisees, a king and a conqueror, forgetting that everyone who earned a woe to you from Jesus resembled James Dobson and Jerry Falwell far more than some trans woman trying to take a pee. I want to end with some positive energy, so I'm going to offer a counterpoint to the Passion of the Christ by gushing for a while about my favorite piece of Jesus media, 1977's Jesus of Nazareth, directed by Franco Zefferilli and co-written by Zefferilli, Suso Kechidemiko, and Anthony Burgess. Besides absolutely adoring Robert Powell's iconic performance as Jesus, I love the way this film looks at Jesus through the eyes of everyone around him. We are constantly made to feel how difficult it would be to know how to react to real miracles happening right before your eyes. When the angel tells Mary she's going to conceive the Son of Man, we see her through the perspective of her mother, which only sees her daughter talking to an open window. The audience can't help but ask themselves, would you believe her? Scene after scene is spent on men of faith talking behind Jesus' back about who they think he is, including a great scene of the Jewish Pharisees puzzling through what to do about this Jesus guy.
That is the richness of our religion, that it's always being kept alive by new ideas.
At no time did he recognize your authority, Caiaphas.
People will run after any new thing.
If I've heard him preach, I was moved.
The Romans will not wait for us to find the answer.
We cannot simply hand over one of our brothers to the Romans.
The sovereignty of Scripture is the glue that holds this entire culture together. People read from it and puzzle over how it applies to their lives. Whenever an Old Testament prophecy is fulfilled by Jesus, there's often some astounded witness who quotes the relevant text, and you can always see in their eyes this surprise, like they can't believe this is what those words they've been studying all their lives actually meant. True faith so often judo flips our formal expertise to childlike wonder. One of the most brilliant touches of Jesus of Nazareth is in how and where it stages its final climax. Just like with her first vision with the angel, we do not get to see the resurrected Jesus appear to Mary. Instead, she comes back to where the 11 remaining disciples are hiding and tells them this crazy story about how he's alive, and now the unspoken question from the beginning of the series becomes explicit.
Well, do any of you believe it? Do you, Andrew? Do you, James? And you, Matthew?
Peter.
oof. I just love this so much.
Peter starts the story as this blue-collar oaf who has no time for holy men.
A lot of talk these days while we all starve.
How? You can preach to the fish.
And even after he starts following Jesus, he tries to gatekeep who can and can't be a disciple.
You would enter the house of a sinner.
He wonders when he might be allowed to go home.
I told my wife I won't be away for long.
He tries to get Jesus not to go to Jerusalem to be killed as prophesied.
You must not allow it to happen.
And of course, during the crucifixion, he denies Christ 3 times.
Of his followers. No, I don't know him. But he is.
The man just doesn't get it. He can't stop grasping for control. But here, he becomes the leader he was always destined to be. Because even in his darkest moment, thanks to Jesus' teaching, he sees only light. Jesus of Nazareth is shot with an unassuming naturalism, out of which emerges these mythic images of sublime fervor. Every time this happens, it is surreal to the point where it's almost off-putting, because they grow from such humble origins, not unlike Jesus himself. My favorite one happens right after the scourging of Christ, which you won't be surprised to hear is brief and less graphic than the Passion by a mile. Nothing is really amped up or lingered on, and notice how weak and pitiful Jesus is here. I love it. After the scourging, he returns to Pilate in this eerie shot where his silhouette appears in the doorway, bathed in sunlight. The crown of thorns and red clothes the guards put on him as a joke now appear truly royal, but as he slowly staggers closer and closer, we can see that he is a dead man walking, so worn out that he can barely open his eyes. And yet, Pilate is now far less relaxed. Somehow, in ways he can't pinpoint, Jesus' weakness has made him stronger. When Jesus does open his eyes, he gazes heavenward, over Pilate, as the light from the doorway creates a kind of halo around him. The first will be last, the last will be first. The Jesus of the Passion goes mano a mano with Pilate and the Pharisees, but in Jesus of Nazareth, he barely seems to notice them. Jesus isn't more powerful than these people, or even his own pain. His secret weapon is that power is beside the point. Pilate is visibly unnerved for the rest of this scene because Jesus, even in his darkest moment, sees only light. There's only one scene of the resurrected Jesus, and even here, the movie resists giving us a shiny Gandalf the White Jesus. No. Victory for this Jesus is sitting with his bros and empowering them to go out and make the world a better place. Just like the Passion, it ends with somebody looking directly into camera.
Don't be afraid. I am with you every day till the end of time.
And here we end with 2 visions of the same faith, confronting us with heaven, confronting us with hell. And for many Christians, I can't help but wonder, which one motivates them most?
Oh man, so excited to finally get my living room wall back. It's been super awkward whenever people come over. I feel like I have to explain. Big news. I've got a second channel. It's called Nathan Now because I'm over there right now more often. It's been going really great. I upload once a week. So just big things. Still gonna be working on this channel a whole bunch too. Don't worry about that. Most of my time on this channel, actually. In fact, the next big video is gonna be about the Saw franchise, 1 through 7 in particular, and really just the whole torture porn subgenre as a whole. I think it's super fascinating, and it's kind of a companion piece to this one too, you know? They're both super preoccupied with like torture and redemption through suffering, as well as rules and hierarchy, except in very different ways, of course. Yeah, and of course, don't forget old Patreon. I could always use any and all support over there. I make patron exclusive videos every so often. In particular, my review of Jordan Peele's Nope, I think, was pretty well received. And yeah, thank you for watching this treatise on Jesus. It's not blasphemy if you recycle.